The Edmonton Oilers extended Vasily Podkolzin. This is a win you should feel good about.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. This upcoming October will be my 10th season doing digital hockey content, and I want to thank everyone that is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we've got your team covered every single day. And today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com, and you can win $300 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, we are going to break down the Vasily Podkolzin extension from a few different lenses. We will do the macro, we will do the micro, and then to wrap up, we will talk about what this means going into the future and maybe some lessons we could take away. So at the outset, I want to start with what is my singular biggest takeaway. And it is important to note that every transaction is not going to go well. And for the Oilers, who as a team that are trying to maintain a window of contention, who have burned a lot of assets, who haven't turned young players into consistent roster players, well, you are going to need to take shots. You are going to need to take stabs in the dark. You are going to need to identify certain types of players from other organizations, whether they're AHL guys, whether they're prospects, or whether they're fringe guys, whether they're fourth liners who you think have a little bit more, whether they're third liners who could be second liners. And targeting a player like Podkolzin, I should say, because they acquired him via trade. They signed him today to an extension. That is an example of pro scouting doing its job. And I come back to the idea of the underutilized player a lot. And there are a few different ways to think about the underutilized player. And players are typecast for all different types of reasons. To not get too moneyball about it, players are miscast or misunderstood for a variety of reasons, whether they're too young, they're too old, they're too tall, they're too small, they're too skinny, they're too heavy, they're from certain countries, they play a certain style. And instead of distilling down what their function is, their baggage, their identifying traits or characteristics, that's what they're characterized by. They are, well, he's a blank or he's too blank. And a player like Podkolzin, who has flashes, and I'm not here to say Podkolzin is going to magically turn a corner. He's going to become a great top six forward. I don't think that's the case. I would be disingenuous if I said that. I do think this is an example of a perfect opportunity arriving, and we'll talk more about that specific idea in our next segment, because I think part of why this worked out so well was it was a very specific set of circumstances. But in the macro, when you are targeting guys to fill specific roles, you need to identify the traits. And I talked about it a lot throughout the course of the last year. And I've been pretty consistent that Podkolzin was one of my favorite stories on the team last year. Podkolzin, Kasperi Kapanen, Troy Stecher to some degree, John Klingberg, the guys who have the narrative. Because make no mistake, if last year didn't go well for Podkolzin, there's a non-zero chance he could have ended up in the AHL. There's a non-zero chance he might not even be in the NHL right now. And that sounds a bit dramatic, but in the context of these NHL careers, especially players who have ties to other leagues, who were born in other countries, it is a lot easier for them, or I should say it's a lot more commonplace for, if the opportunities are not there, they'll go back to Europe. And for someone like Podkolzin, who clearly has some upside, and I'm not here to misconstrue it. You know, his career high in goals in the season is 14. That came as a rookie with the Canucks. But that's a functional NHL player. Anybody who can score 14 goals in the National Hockey League is more than just a plug. We're not talking about a Tanner Glass. We're not talking about a Matt Rempe, a Ryan Reeves. 14 goals is nothing to sneeze at. That is real quantifiable production that matters. Now, we do need to understand the context of that, and we'll, again, dive into that more in our second segment, so I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. But when you are in the business of vampirism like the Oilers are, and I use that word specifically because that's what they're doing. They need to identify players on other teams or free agents or European free agents who are, for whatever reason, not getting a chance where they are, whether it's their logjam, they're blocked in front, or if the coach just doesn't trust them for whatever reason. The Oilers need to make that Faustian bargain. They need to stick their hands out and say, hey, you see how you're not getting any playing time over there? If you come here, we'll give you playing time. And it creates a bit of a self-fulfilling cycle that the Oilers are going to need to keep filling out their forward group. They're going to keep having guys in one or two spots throughout their 12 forwards who are going to rotate year over year. There's just not enough money to go around to lock someone up long term. And it's in their interest to keep that spot revolving, to keep trying to get better, or maybe fine tune that spot a little bit. And the reason I said at the top it's important that the Oilers keep swinging is they have made their fair share of misses. You point at Jack Campbell, and look, real quick, as an aside, Victor Arvidsson and Jeff Skinner gave the Oilers decent hockey last year, but neither guy was really what the Oilers were looking for the roles they were signed to. So I understand why Stan Bowman ultimately chose to move on from both of them in the offseason. But when you are in the business of needing to replace 2, 3, 4 forward spots in an offseason, you're going to need to take some chances. And some chances, like Podkolzin, are going to work out, and some, like Arvidsson or Jeff Skinner, are not. And that is simply the nature of transactions in hockey. Now, that's not to say we go willy-nilly and we ignore underlying factors, we ignore environmental context, but at the very least, we have learned a lesson here that guys who have demonstrated something at the NHL level are not unfixable. A lot of the time, for guys like Podkolzin, who have demonstrated some NHL success, it comes down to a coach giving them a chance to prove themselves and building their own confidence. And I do not hesitate in saying Podkolzin getting the run he did with Draisaitl last year altered the trajectory of his NHL career. And that sounds hyperbolic, but if Podkolzin spends the entirety of last year on the fourth line, he plays there with Derek Ryan, with Corey Perry, with Kapanen, with Janmark, whoever you want to say, he doesn't put up those counting stats. He doesn't get the role he does in the playoffs. And again, Podkolzin ideally is not a second liner on a Stanley Cup caliber team, but his specific skill set is something Leon Draisaitl likes a lot. There's a reason that Kapanen and Podkolzin played so much with Leon last year. And it's not a coincidence Leon scored as many goals as he did last year because he was the primary trigger man. He was the guy who was out there with 2 forecheckers when it was Kapanen, Podkolzin, and him. When you have 2 genuine hard-nosed, dog-chasing tennis ball forecheckers the way Kapanen and Podkolzin are, that lets Leon cook. When you have your sequences end with the best player on your line getting a majority of the shots, majority of the scoring chances, you're increasing your probability of eventually scoring. And Podkolzin, to his credit, has a skill set, that forechecking, that hard skating, the willingness to throw his body around, that the Oilers don't have a lot of. I don't think it's hyperbole to say Podkolzin is the Oilers' best forechecker now, especially no Vander Kane, no Corey Perry. And look, I know Corey Perry's forechecking wasn't in the same vein, but Corey Perry was pretty effective on the cycle last year, and that's going to need to be replaced. And Podkolzin is someone who brings a very specific skill set to the table that is going to end up being really valuable for what the Oilers want him to be. But a guy like Podkolzin, it is not the flashiest. It is not the most exciting skill set, but it is an important one if you are going to go far. And coming up next on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, we're going to break down what Podkolzin means for the core of the Oilers going forward, more specifically this upcoming season in our second segment. But don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. The NFL season is here, and FanDuel is making sure you're ready for kickoff with a can't-miss offer. Because right now, new FanDuel customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use on the FanDuel app. I love FanDuel because it makes however you want to play easy. If you like player props, if you want to cook up a same game parlay, or you have a feeling as a game's happening and want a live bet, FanDuel makes it happen. Tomorrow night, important game in the NFC West between the Seahawks and the Cardinals. The Seahawks 1.5-point road favorites. That's definitely a bit eye-opening. Sneaky good game in the NFC. The Eagles at the Bucs. The Eagles 3.5-point road favorites. And of course, Jackson Dart making his NFL starting debut for the New York Football Giants against the LA Chargers. That line is up to Chargers 6.5. FanDuel has one question. Are you ready? Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com to get started. One more time, that's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet for a chance at $300 in bonus bets. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers as we are making our way through the week, breaking down Vasily Podkolzin. I almost said Leon Draisaitl. That was last year. Breaking down Vasily Podkolzin's extension and what it means for the Oilers going forward. So, in practice, the Oilers, especially on the wing this season, are going to ride the hot hand. And I don't think that's a crazy leap to take. I think when you look at this group, especially once you get past Zach Hyman, who probably won't be back till mid-November or maybe early November if things break right. But my assumption is we are going to go with the hot hand because there is so much to be determined. Is Ryan Nugent-Hopkins going to play center or is he going to play wing? Is Trent Frederick going to get a crack in the top six? Is Podkolzin? Is Kapanen? Is Ike Howard? Is Matthew Savoie? Being that there is so much to figure out amongst this group, especially in terms of who's going to play with who, it's only natural that we speculate. And of course, I think there's a strong argument that Nugent-Hopkins, especially when you look at some of the underlying numbers him and McDavid have put up together last year at 5-on-5, I think there's an argument that spot needs to be better. And Mangiapane, maybe. Trent Frederick, maybe. Ike Howard, maybe. Matthew Savoie, maybe. But as far as Podkolzin goes, we know he works with Leon Draisaitl, and him and Draisaitl do a really good job of manufacturing game control. And game control does not necessarily correlate with winning, but it increases your chances of winning. And when I talk about game control, I mean keeping the puck at the other end of the ice, not in the end occupied by Stuart Skinner or Calvin Pickard. If we're cycling the puck down low, if we're dumping it in, the puck is as far away from our own goal line as it can be. We are generating offensive zone time. We are giving our players an opportunity to make plays. I think Podkolzin's game is pretty simple. I think Podkolzin's game probably, if the Oilers had any player of a lower caliber than Draisaitl, I don't think you could get away with Podkolzin in that spot. But I think if you want a way to picture Podkolzin in the abstract, I think your best comp is something along the lines of what Capo Caco was doing in a higher and a lower leverage role for the Rangers. I think Podkolzin is a lower end version of what, and I'm not saying he's Valeri Nichushkin, but I think the practical function in terms of skill and where he is in the lineup, that's your comp. He's not, and obviously Podkolzin doesn't have the offensive ability that Nichushkin does. Nichushkin can be a 50 or 60 point guy playing alongside high-end talent. But I do think there is a useful role for a big, pugnacious forechecking player who's strong on the cycle in a team's top six. In an ideal world, your guy has a little more skill. But I think between Trent Frederick and Podkolzin, one of those two guys is going to get a real chance in the top six. I'm inclined to believe, based on Podkolzin's track record, especially last year with Leon, I think by virtue of where you saw him in the pecking order in the postseason in particular, I think there's a comfortability there for Chris Knoblauch with what Podkolzin brings. And it is an invaluable skill set. I would venture to say the Oilers need more forechecking, bang low guys who are going to be annoying to play against and in a functional way. I'm not talking about in the Evander Kane or Matt Rempe after the whistle, igniting, trying to fight guys kind of way. I am talking about you get the puck in deep, the other team's defensemen turn their back to the oncoming forecheck to retrieve the puck, and they get thumped. And then the forecheck is engaged, the Oilers can seal off the walls and look to attack the net quickly. Without foot speed, and to be fair, the Oilers are a slow team, even though they employ Leon Draisaitl and Connor McDavid, I think the Oilers are going to have to lean into their wall play a little bit more this year than they have in years past. And I think Podkolzin can help you with that. I think to some degree, Podkolzin is an imperfect solution to the Oilers' problem. I think in an ideal world, the Oilers would have a 25 or 30 goal guy they could sprinkle into their top six on the wing. But being the realities of the cap are what they are, Podkolzin is basically there to amplify what Draisaitl's good at. And I was talking about this last week, the idea that anytime a sequence ends in a shot from a defenseman or a 35-footer from a forward, that's not a great play. And what Podkolzin, and by extension, you say the same thing, when the Oilers were playing Kapanen and Podkolzin with Draisaitl, they were telling Leon, do whatever you want, cook, go to the net, try and score goals, set these guys up, because you're playing an elite playmaker. Leon is a great goal scorer. He's an even better distributor with two puck retrievers, two guys whose best trait is their forechecking. You are giving Leon carte blanche to be creative, to be explosive. And I don't think it's a coincidence you saw Draisaitl play some of the best hockey of his career last year, getting to shotgun guys. And generally, you would like to have a higher end guy, of course. Anytime, you always want goal scorers, but the realities of the Oilers cap are what they are. They've needed to be creative here. They have needed to try and amplify the existing guys' traits with facsimile products. And Podkolzin, to his credit, embraced that role last year as Leon's forechecker. Leon likes playing with him. I hope we see more of that combination. That does make things complicated for Ike Howard or Matthew Savoie or Trent Frederick or Andrew Mangiapane once Zach Hyman comes back, especially if we get to a point where out of necessity or familiarity, Chris Knoblauch goes back to playing Ryan Nugent-Hopkins alongside Connor McDavid. That is not out of the question. So with even one fewer spots to go on that left side, what does that do for everyone else? And it raises a fair question. The Oilers have a semi-good problem. It never hurts to have options. But at the same time, if you have options to the degree the Oilers have, that tells you somebody has not separated. That tells you somebody has not proven themselves enough that you are considering 6 or 7 guys. You know, it goes back to that old Bill Parcells quote, if you have 2 quarterbacks, you don't have one. And I think the Oilers have enough talent that they can get away with this in the regular season. I think there might be a little bit more juice to squeeze out of Podkolzin. I think he can be a 10 to 15 goal guy if everything breaks right for him, if he plays in the top 6 for a majority of the year. But I don't think there's anything beyond that in his game. That does mean the Oilers are going to need more offense. That means whoever ends up on the right of Draisaitl and Podkolzin is going to have some work to do. But at the same time, Podkolzin's traits give something to that Leon line that is invaluable. He helps Leon have the puck more. Anytime the Oilers can get the puck to Draisaitl more, that is a good outcome for the Edmonton Oilers. We are going to take our second and final break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we'll talk about what signing Podkolzin means for the Oilers core going forward. Thank you to everyone who is listening to this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers. Thanks to everyone who's making it their first listen of the day. So something we've talked about a lot on Locked On Oilers, especially over the last week, we talked about it on Monday. The Oilers are at an organizational crossroads, and it starts with the McDavid extension, which is still up in the air. But Connor's been consistent in saying that his goal is to win a Stanley Cup, and he would like to sign to stay in Edmonton if he feels they have a good chance to win a Stanley Cup in the long term. And I mention long term because when you look at the Oilers roster, there are not a lot of certainties. You have Leon for a while. You have Zach Hyman for 3 more years. You have Ryan Nugent-Hopkins for 4 more years. You have Trent Frederick for 5 more years. You have Mangiapane for 2. You have Matthias Janmark for 2. You have Podkolzin now for 3 more after this year. You have Ike Howard. You have Matthew Savoie. Beyond that, the defense could look entirely different 2 years from now, as we've talked about quite a bit over the last few weeks. Ekholm and Wallman are unrestricted free agents after this year. Ditto Brett Kulak, and both Calvin Pickard and Stuart Skinner are unrestricted free agents after this year. The Oilers roster is not very set in stone. That has advantages, like we've been talking about, like we emphasized in that first segment. It allows you to roll the dice in the free agent market. It allows you to take some volume, buy some trades at volume to try and find one or two solutions, and you keep re-racking. Of course, the more question marks you have, the more roster spots you need to fill, the higher the degree of difficulty to do it all successfully. I think last offseason is a good example of that. Podkolzin and Emberson worked out pretty well, and Arvidsson and Skinner worked out okay. They did not work out great. But the more volume you have, the increased volatility you have. And I don't know what Connor thinks of this core. I think I can make the argument that this core has since peaked, that the team they had 2 years ago was the best Matthias Ekholm they were going to have, was the best depth they were going to have between Warren Fogle, between the returning from injury Connor Brown, between Dylan Holloway and Philip Broberg and Cody Ceci. That was the deepest version the Oilers were going to have. Now there is an argument to be made. The Oilers missed their shot, that they're going to need to re-rack here, that a year or two from now, they're going to need to find a way to revitalize this supporting cast, especially because Nuge, because Zach Hyman, they're getting older. Adam Henrique's going to need a replacement soon. That leaves you with a lot of ambiguity as to what Connor, Evan Bouchard, Leon Draisaitl, and Darnell Nurse's supporting cast is going to be. The Oilers could have 2 new goalies next summer. They don't know what they have in Trent Frederick. Is Andrew Mangiapane an 11-goal guy, or is he a 25-goal guy? Is Ike Howard good enough? Is Matthew Savoie good enough? With all of that uncertainty, I do think it's good they took care of Podkolzin. And I think Podkolzin isn't a foundational piece by any stretch, but I think he's a functional player. I think there is upside to be tapped into, and that's why I'm so optimistic about this signing. The money, it's cheap. As the cap goes up, that number is going to become even more palatable. He knows what he is. Podkolzin is not calling heat checks. He's not calling his own number. He's not going into business for himself. This is a solid supporting piece who overachieved in a role he hadn't really played before last year. Now, if Podkolzin plays on the second line for a majority of next year and he finishes with 9 goals, I think then we can have a conversation about him being a bit miscast in that role. And again, if he only has 9, but Leon has 60 again, I think we'd all be okay with that because there'd be an understanding there that because Podkolzin's style facilitates Leon scoring more, I think we're all okay with that. But let's say we're dealing with a run-of-the-mill 48, 50-goal Leon season. Podkolzin only gives you 8, and then whoever's on the right, Kapanen, Savoie, whoever gives you like 9 or 10. Is that enough offense from your second line at 5-on-5? Is that enough? And I don't have a great answer for you because I don't think there's a way to know until we see it. I don't know what Draisaitl and Podkolzin will look like for a full 82 games if that's what Chris Knoblauch opts for. We know how much Knoblauch likes to make his lineup around pairs. I've talked about this quite a lot when we do our position group previews last week. I talked about how last year it was McDavid and Zach Hyman, it was Draisaitl, Podkolzin, it was Adam Henrique and Connor Brown. And when you have that, it makes it a little bit easier to try and figure out the lineup holes. When you're only rotating one side of your lineup, that enables you to mix and match one spot. The more spots you are rotating or alternating, the harder it's going to be to figure out what it is. It's going to be harder to figure out how the pieces fit together. You're looking at the puzzle, but you don't know what it's supposed to look like when all the pieces are put together. And I think there's a world where Podkolzin spends 75 games on Leon's left. He has 12 or 13 goals. He isn't the most efficient player, probably like a 5 or 6% shooting percentage. He has a ton of hits, but the Oilers have good possession numbers in his minutes. They outscore opponents at 5-on-5. I think there's a world where Podkolzin ends up on the 4th line for half the season. He finishes with 8 or 9 goals. He moonlights in the top 6 on occasion when Chris Knoblauch feels he needs a bit more of a defense first look, and that's fine. For this price point, at this point in NHL history, Podkolzin is a fair value. The Oilers' hope, and I said this about Trent Frederick the other day, and I'll say it now about Podkolzin, the Oilers' hope is there is more here. The Oilers' hope is that in giving Podkolzin the financial reassurance, giving him an extension, giving him a chance to play with Leon, or with Connor for that matter, he can get to that next tier. And going from 8 to 15 goals isn't crazy, but it would be a big leap for Podkolzin. And that's the important scale here, because we're extracting as much as we can from what we have. Because when you are a team that is up against the cap the way the Oilers are, you need to be maximizing every last dollar you spend. I was very judgmental about the overpays for some of the guys last summer. They gave raises to Henrique and Corey Perry and Connor Brown. And in a vacuum, each of those being like $250,000, $300,000 more than each guy was worth was not a big deal. But when you add that up, that's $800,000. That's another player. And when you're up against it, the way the Oilers are salary cap wise, every last dollar is going to matter, especially now that we're dealing with an environment where there's going to be a salary cap in the postseason. You can't double retain salaries anymore. You are going to have to stretch your dollar for as much as you can get. So if there's more to get out of Podkolzin, out of Trent Frederick, out of Mangiapane, out of Ike Howard, out of Matthew Savoie, out of Adam Henrique, out of Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, out of Matthias Janmark, the Oilers have to find a way to do it. And guys like Podkolzin, they're not flashy, but they get the job done. These are the types of guys, and I would love it if the Oilers had another winger and Podkolzin could be a third, fourth line tweener, a bottom six left wing, because I think he would do I think Vasily Podkolzin could do a really good job of being the Barclay Goodrow proxy on a Stanley Cup caliber team, the way Barclay Goodrow was in Tampa Bay, playing with Yanni Gourde and Blake Coleman. That line was so overqualified to be a third line on a Stanley Cup caliber team. But when you have Cirelli and you have Braden Point and Stamkos and Kucherov and Palat and Killorn, there isn't spots for you. And when you can optimize a guy by putting him lower in the lineup and giving him easier matchups, you'll be shocked what you can manufacture, what you can make happen. And I like this signing a lot. And I said this earlier, I'll say it again real quick before we get out of here. This is one of my favorite stories on the team last year. This is a guy who could have been on his way out of the NHL if it didn't go well for him. And instead, he parlayed that into a multi-year extension to stay. And he'll probably get a lot of looks with Draisaitl, the second best player on this team, one of the 5 best players in the world. And I'm fascinated to see how Podkolzin responds to that security. Some guys, they play that 1 or 2 year deal in the market over and over and over again, and they bounce around to half the teams in the league. And really quickly, you're Lee Stempniak. But Podkolzin deserved an extension. He was a great story last year. I'm really excited to see what he can do going forward. That will do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. Thank you so much to everyone who made Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. We're approaching 2,600 subscribers. Cannot believe it. So grateful to everyone who's here. And yes, I do have a stuffy nose. Yes, my ring light did die at the 8-minute mark, and that's why it's dark for a minute. And I had to pause the recording and start over. Not start over, excuse me, but let my ring light charge for 20 minutes so it would look presentable. We strive for the best here at Locked On Oilers. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.